gyms are reopened, you want to get as strong as possible, as quickly as possible, but is it a trap? In today's presentation, we're going to be talking about what a Get Strong Quick program is, what I think are the most underrated and often neglected variables when it comes to programming, how often you should be even testing your strength, the key difference between what you see on social media, which is often strength testing, and what you should perhaps be prioritizing, which in my opinion is strength development, and finally the concept of free games. So where do we start? What is a Get Strong Quick program? For me, anytime you've seen strength programs which encourage you to purchase it because it'll add 20 kilos to your squat, 40 kilos to your deadlift, have you bench pressing a house in 3 weeks time. This for me is a Get Strong Quick program because it sells you the increase in strength straight away. And if you're looking to increase your strength, it probably stands to reason that you think, well, why am I going to spend 3 months to get the same strength gains if I can only get them in, say, 1.5 months? But what are the drawbacks, if any? The first question for me is, do these programs work? Now, I would answer that with a very confident, it depends. The reason why I say that is, why do you want to get strong fast in the first place? Is it because you're looking to improve sports performance? Is it because you've heard that being stronger is closely linked to having more muscle mass? Or is it simply because you're impatient, you're a male with an ego, and you think, I would like to be able to lift what I used to lift before lockdown? Dan John's joke about practicing your sport 4 times a week and lifting weights for 3 times a week for the next 8 years is something that springs to mind. But the reason why I say this is because the longer you take to develop a certain physical quality, the longer it also tends to stick around. Likewise, if you've been, for example, strength training or training to improve your muscle mass, and this has been built over years, then chances are this is going to stick around a lot longer than someone who's only been training for 6 weeks. My analogy here is that it's easier to maintain strength once you have a lot of it in the first place. So if we take house prices, for example, if all house prices depreciated 10%, the guy who owns the wealthiest house or the biggest house still owns the most wealthiest estate. Despite the fact that everything is depreciated 10%, his is still worth more than yours. Likewise, the guys who were the strongest in the gym when lockdown had started or had the most strength training experience are probably going to still be the strongest guys, all other things being equal, when the gyms reopen. Secondly, when we talk about do they work, again, this depends on how we are qualifying that a program has worked. You might say, oh, well, I did a strength training program. I ended up putting on more weight in the last few weeks of the program than when I started. Therefore, I must be stronger. And this is a subject that I've spoken about at length with my powerlifting coach, in that, is this a chicken egg relationship? Did you get stronger because you put more weight on the bar? Or was it because you were putting more weight on the bar that allowed you to get stronger? This might seem semantic, but this will determine how we program, because, for example, if we assume that we have to be putting on more weight on the bar in order to get stronger, what happens when all of a sudden life stress kicks in? You're a lot more fatigued, you're underslept, you're, for example, malnourished, or you've not been eating properly, but the program says in order to get stronger, you need to put more weight on the bar. And for example, for the last few weeks, you've been adding weight, and now all of a sudden with extra fatigue, you can no longer add weight. Now, if you think that adding weight on the bar leads to the adaptations, all of a sudden you're in a position where you're failing lifts because you've been told that adding load is what leads to adaptation. I'd probably say, for the record, that the body has to adapt to a certain stimulus at a certain point with a given level of fatigue in order for you to get better. So for example, if I squat 100 kilos in week 1 and the effort level feels like a 7 out of 10, and then next week I could increase it to 105 kilos and it feels like an 8 out of 10, have I really got stronger, or have I added weight to the bar? Again, if you're interested in listening to me talk about that topic in more detail, check out my video with my powerlifting coach, Charlie Keane, or the Barbell Medicine podcast, Adaptations versus Overload, for more details. I will link those in the show notes. More interestingly, when I say do these programs work, there are 4 methods by which we can increase our 1 repetition max. And the reason why these are important is because this comes back to why do we want to get strong fast in the first place. So if we're trying to get stronger for the purpose of enhancing sports performance, this is where things get a little bit fuzzy. And I use the word fuzzy because for different sports, strength is going to be more of a contributing quality. Now, for sports such as football, yes, there are research papers that say, for example, stronger athletes will sprint faster, jump higher, recover from injury or be more resilient to injury. However, it's also worth keeping in mind that force is just mass times acceleration. The athletes who are generally more powerful and jump higher, sprint faster, will probably also be able to shift more weight in the gym. I remember getting into a debate once with somebody in the gym who tried telling me that Usain Bolt wasn't a strong athlete. And I said, you try accelerating 92 kilos down a 100-meter track faster than anyone in the world, and it's in an action where it's one single leg is on the floor for fractions of a second at a time, and tell me that he's not strong. But the reason why I say this is because, again, sprinting and strength is highly correlated to acceleration. And again, once we get past, I would say, a baseline level of strength, then other things such as technique obviously are going to play a more contributing role. So changes to the muscle tendon unit. So this is, for example, the strength of the muscles, the ability of the tendons to store and recoil elastic energy. That's going to be something that is going to improve our 1 rep max. And if we improve that quality, so whether it's strength training or plyometrics, we're probably going to see an increase in 1 repetition maximum. Likewise, if we increase the amount of force that someone can voluntarily produce, then we're also going to see an increase in 1 repetition maximum. Interestingly, in studies that have looked at how we get stronger, when it comes to voluntary activation, you can literally be strapped into a machine. They can show you, or they can demonstrate artificially how much motor units or muscle fibers that could be innovated if a machine was to do that job for you. As you get stronger, your ability to recruit more motor units or to utilize more muscle fibers increases. So people who are stronger literally can, the analogy I use is recruit more employees or more muscle fibers for the task. So for example, if you've got a well-trained athlete, I would say they are similar to like a Tesco or an Asda megastore, where they've got so many employees or motor units working for them that they're going to be able to produce a high level of output. In comparison, someone who is relatively untrained or has not really been exposed to strength training is like the equivalent of the corner shop, which has 1 or 2 employees. No matter how hard those 1 or 2 employees work, and no matter how much you try and get the most out of those 1 or 2 employees, they're just not going to be able to compete with, say, 100 employees at a megastore. Next, improvements in technique. Does that improve sports performance? So I would say, in my experience, for younger level athletes, if you're teaching a youth athlete how to squat or how to lunge or how to brace, that's probably, and in my experience it does, transfer over to stuff like jumping performance, sprinting performance, landing performance. But that's very simply because anything you do with a youth athlete or an untrained athlete in the weight room tends to enhance sports performance. However, once you get past relatively low-ish levels of strength, then you're probably going to need to start working technique. And the beginning phase, strength is basically a cure-all, seems to transfer to sprinting, jump performance, throwing velocity, change of direction measures, pretty much impacts everything. But then after this, very rudimental entry-level strength. So typically I found anything from 0 to 1.5 times body weight seems to transfer really well. And then it kind of peters off. There's loads of stuff in the literature about this mythical 2 times body weight. And from my own experience, again, N equals 1, I remember saying to coaches I was working with at the time, how come I'm squatting near double body weight and yet I'm still not sprinting faster or jumping higher than, for example, these hockey players I'm working with, these rugby lads I'm working with? And the coaches just turned around to me and said, well, how much time do you spend sprinting and jumping versus how much sprinting they're doing in a game and through their conditioning work? I was like, oh yeah, how funny. I don't sprint and I don't jump and I'm not very good at it. So strength, although it's a foundation, can only take you so far. So improvements in technique in the weight room will only improve sports performance if the athlete is at a relatively low level. If they're at a high level, then the nuances of the individual techniques is going to take over. But at a low level, for example, a counter movement jump or improving a barbell squat would probably lead to improvements in different jumps, whether it's a layup in basketball, whether it is, for example, jumping for a header in football. It's going to improve all of these, but after a certain level, that's going to start to not transfer as well because of the nuances between the jumps and as you become more highly specialized in the sport. Then there's the subject of intermuscular coordination. Now, does improvements in intermuscular coordination improve sports performance? Again, I would say that research tells us that the elite athletes, obviously they produce more force, but the more important thing is they can relax in between contractions better than their non-elite counterparts. So elite athletes are better able to switch between the contraction and the relaxation phase. And from studies that I've seen during my undergraduate, one of the other adaptations to strength is that the muscle on the opposing side of the joint, so for example the hamstrings versus the quadriceps in a squat, the hamstrings oppose the muscle force from the quadriceps less in more experienced athletes. And there's studies to show that how the brain contributes to muscle firing patterns also changes for the better as well. But as I said, that's probably going down another rabbit hole. But if we improve these 4 factors, so changes to how the muscle tendon unit works, changes to voluntary activation, changes to intermuscular coordination, and improvements in technique, if we can enhance those 4 factors, we know we'll improve our 1 repetition maximum strength. But then it depends why we want to improve that 1 repetition maximum in the first place as to whether we decide these programs work. If all we're doing is doing these programs to increase the amount of weight we lift, then yes, they do work. If we are increasing our 1 repetition maximum because we think it will improve performance in our sport, that is a very definite maybe they work. So now let's look at intensity and volume when it comes to get strong, quick programs. In an ideal world, intensity and volume should always be inversely related. They're like a seesaw, unless you're doing something like Smolov, which is both high intensity and high volume, in which case, congratulations, you're a fucking idiot. Guilty as charged. If you've ever tried to skip gears in a car, it works if you're already up to speed. So for example, if you're trying to skip from say 3rd to 5th, then the car doesn't struggle at all skipping those gears. So what I mean by that is if you've got a history of strength training and you have not only got a history of it, but you've been strength training regularly, then you can quite easily ramp up the volume or the intensity and not break down as a result, or you're less likely to break down than, for example, someone who's literally just started training. Whereas if you're coming into or back into the gym following a period of absence from lockdown, with gyms being closed, then ramping up the intensity and or volume very quickly is probably going to lead to you breaking down. So if we want to get strong quick, ideally we need to ensure that volume and intensity are opposed. And I'd even go as far as to saying, even if we want to get strong over the long haul, there needs to be periods where we prioritize volume, which I'll get to in a second, and periods where we prioritize intensity. Something like Dan John's easy strength, you never go over 10 total repetitions in a lift. The volume is really low. The intensity can therefore be relatively high. And obviously, because of this, because you're not doing a bunch of unnecessary repetitions, typically fatigue is kept relatively low. A quote that I love from my masters is soon ripe, soon rotten. Again, this goes back to me saying, if your entire training history centers around a 6-week block of strength training, you will lose that strength very, very quickly. If, like myself, you've taken a more longitudinal approach, I've been strength training for the past 6 or 7 years, and as you'll see from my numbers that you're about to see after 5.5 months off, strength doesn't really depreciate that quickly once you've spent a long time building it. So as I said, what are the downsides? You build strength in 6 weeks, then it will disappear relatively quickly. Do these programs work? yes, if the aim is to add more weight to the bar, but don't be surprised if, for example, you see a rapid appreciation and then a kind of leveling off as you struggle because you need to go back and add more input. Now, this is one of my favorite slides of the presentation. How do we continually add strength? Something that will cause a lot of conflict depending on who you speak to is the concept of what comes first, strength or hypertrophy. Do you need to, for example, increase your muscle size first and then have that bigger muscle produce more force, so i.e. going from hypertrophy training into strength training? Or do you need to get stronger in order to teach the muscle to produce more force and therefore lift more weight, cause more muscle damage, and therefore induce more hypertrophy or more muscle mass? I've covered this topic of increasing muscle mass and the 3 main factors that lead to increases in muscle mass in another video, which I'll link down below. But here are my thoughts. My opinion is that most people need to get stronger in order to increase muscle mass. The reason why I say this, and the caveat that I attach to this, is that most people aim for the metabolic stress side of increasing muscle mass. So the 3 main methods of hypertrophy or increasing muscle mass are: 1, inducing high levels of metabolic stress. This is a fancy way of saying go for the burn type training. So basically doing stuff like curls until your arms feel like they're going to fall off, doing stuff like drop sets, giant sets, supersets, anything with a muscle, but you feel muscle burn. On the flip side, another one of the main mechanisms is mechanical tension. This is a fancy way of saying how much weight did you actually lift. Now, because most people in the gym will go for this to failure approach with single joint exercises, they never really build the whole body strength in order to innovate as many motor units or muscle fibers as possible. So with compound lifts, so this is lifts that use a lot of muscle mass, so your squats, bench press, overhead press, chin-ups, deadlifts, that's going to target as many muscles as possible. You're going to get strong across the widest range of muscle groups as possible. I think most people spend 80% of their training time training the smaller muscle lifts, like for example curls, flies, lateral raises, targeting smaller muscles or isolated movements, and only 20% on compound exercises. I think if you flip those 2 round, you have the best combination of both worlds. A final note on what most people, or what I would call accessory exercises. So these are the single joint isolation or movements. Typically, people who are smaller can get away with less of those movements because of the way that their muscles attach. So if you've got, for example, someone like myself, 5'6", generally smaller bones, this is partly the reason why I think my quads have developed so well just through deep squatting, and why I've gotten away with not really using accessory exercises for both the upper body and the lower body, because you get a lot of byproduct muscle development just from the main lifts. Taller lifters obviously have a longer distance between where their joints and muscles attach, so they're probably going to need to spend a bit more time using those accessory lifts for higher rep ranges. But in general, I would cycle your program through where you spend part of your program going for a hypertrophy approach, so building bigger muscles. Then you transition into slightly lower rep ranges. So for example, let's say you spend 3 to 7 weeks developing muscle mass with, for example, the 10 to 12 rep range. You might then bring that down into a strength block where you're spending a lot of time in, say, the 6 to 8-ish rep range. And then by peaking, I mean we're basically bringing the loads as high as possible, and we're working in the 1 to 5 rep range. Peaking is, for me, about testing your strength under the highest load conditions. The amount of technical precision you need at 70% is nowhere near the same as the technical precision you need at 95%. In speaking to people on, for example, Instagram or whatever, they'll start their programs with relatively low percentages and will let their technique get sloppy because they can. For example, if you're deadlifting 60%, you don't really have to reset the bar each time. You don't really have to take that big belly breath in. You don't really have to lock the bar in with your lats. You can get away with all of these things. However, if psychologically you're not dialing down on these factors, you can't expect to go, for example, for a 16-week program, having never done it, and then get to the peaking phase where the loads are higher and you can't not do these things and expect it to magically appear. So the takeaway from this slide is simply that you cannot pull your body in different directions for too long and expect to make optimal progress. If you start to notice that you are missing lifts, you can either take it one step back and look at, for example, subtle variations of the lift. So for example, where does it break down? As I'll show you in videos in a couple of slides, is it because you've got no control on the descent of your squat? Okay, what peaking lifts might be useful for this? So for example, you might go for a pin squat, you might go for 3 seconds down, 1 second pause, and up as fast as you can squat. You might go for a pause squat. These would be lifts that would be focused in your peaking phase, because you're specifically looking at technically, you're assuming that the lift is breaking down because of a technical point. Equally, you might take it one step back for even further and think, I'm just simply not strong enough to lift these loads. I need to spend more time developing strength in order for me to justify being able to lift these loads. Again, you might take it back a step even further, which is something that I've personally benefited from massively, and that was adding muscle mass in the off season by using the 8 to 12 rep range and also bringing up weak muscle areas that contribute to the lifts, such as the triceps for the bench press, or for example the quadriceps for both the deadlift and the squat. Again, if you want more information on training for hypertrophy, check out my science and the bro science video, which will be in the description. The next thing I want to talk about is assets versus liabilities. Now, in the finance world, an asset is anything that puts money in your pocket. A liability is anything that takes money from your pocket. Interestingly, something that I learned in one of the books I was reading of late is that most people think that their house is an asset. Now, whilst technically speaking, it is in the sense of it's a physical thing that someone can't necessarily take away from you. The reality is if you're paying rent each month and you're not keeping up to date with the bills, that's taking money out of your pocket. Now, if you owned a house that you were renting out, that's putting money in your pocket. The reason why I use this long-winded analogy is a lot of people look at certain exercises as assets and it's giving them free gains, when actually it's taking away from gains that could be made in the future. So the way I look at exercises is on this cost to benefit ratio. For example, I would say that working your mobility or your technique is an asset, and it's also going to give you what I call compound interest, or what the finance world called compound interest. Compound interest is effectively what interest rate you get on the interest rate you've already collected. So let's say if you start off with £100 in the bank, let's say you get 5% interest, that goes up to £105, and then for example the next time that interest rate is paid, it's paid on the £100 that was originally in there and the £5 that was interest in there already. So effectively this is free money, for want of a better word. Now, some exercises give us compound interest, in my opinion, because it's basically the equivalent of free money. You need to think which exercises are assets, so they're giving you not just gains in that specific exercise itself, but gains in other exercises. And I'll get on to explain this in an example in a little bit more detail in a second. Which exercises are actually just robbing you. So for example, and again, there is nothing wrong with barbell curls or tricep isolation work. I've literally just explained in the previous slide that tricep work or tricep development, if programmed properly, may eventually give you stepping stones to something like a bigger bench. But if, for example, you're smashing your triceps all the time to the point where when you need to do your bench and your high force work that you can't put as much load on the bar, then it's a bit of a liability. Equally, I think technique can be a liability if the risk-reward relationship is skewed. So for example, if you're deadlifting in a competition, you might see people with all sorts of funky technique. In a competition, that's kind of fine really, because the aim of, for example, powerlifting competition is to get as much load on the bar. You lift like that all the time and it's inefficient, and you're potentially running the risk of injury. Again, although the relationship between technique and injury isn't as solid as people like to think, but for argument's sake, let's say that lifting with a bad technique does cause an injury, then you're potentially risking losing, I don't know, 2 to 3 months off of training for the sake of that 1 RM to show off to your friends. Is it really worth it? I would say something like improving mobility and technique in the squat is going to be a compound interest or an asset, because, and this is something I've experienced personally, the deeper you can sit into a squat and the easier that is, the more range of motion you can obviously use. The more range of motion you can use for a muscle, the more muscle damage it's going to incur. So hypothetically, let's take athlete A, who squats 100 kilos with the shallowest of knee bends that you would see in a commercial gym. Athlete B can sit his ass to his heels and come up and also uses 100 kilos. All other things being equal, the athlete who's going to a deeper range of motion is going to get stronger, bigger, across a larger range of motion sooner than the person who is doing the shallow knee bends. Equally, if, for example, you are looking at becoming a bodybuilder, if your mobility is awful and, for example, your shoulders are rounded to the point where you've got classic T-Rex type posture and you're looking to get on stage, then you're never going to be able to optimally develop the muscles at the front because they are so shortened and it's affected your posture. Now, if that poor posture starts to impact on stuff like injury risk, starts to interfere with your sleep, then it interferes with your training. Again, something that started off is a liability is now impacting other areas of your training and is taking effectively potential progress away from you. So which of your which of your exercises are assets? Which of them are liabilities? This brings me on to my podcast with The Mindful Mover, one of my most popular podcasts to date, and in it they spoke about what they call the Big Five. These are the exercises they believe that offer the widest range of gains with the fewest possible exercises. So for example, one of their examples is something like a planche push-up, saying that if you work towards a planche push-up, you're going to experience gains in your weighted dips, you're going to potentially experience gains in your bench press, you're going to potentially experience gains in all other pressing movements. The reason why I personally do like the Big Five is because when I worked towards a one-arm chin-up, as I've done during lockdown, I trained once a week with my chin-ups. I did 5 total reps. I applied something called accommodating resistance, which is basically where you make each portion of the rep maximally difficult. And I managed to go from a 41.25 kilo weighted chin-up 5.5 months ago. I haven't done a single weighted chin-up since. First day back in the gym, and I added 1.25 kilos onto my weighted chin-ups. Now you might be like, oh, 1.25 kilos in 5.5 months, whoop do you fucking do? But the reality is I hadn't done a single weighted chin-up, and I've managed to increase strength having not done it. That for me is a free gain, and I only did 5 total reps a week for that. If you're interested to find out how I did that, then check out my videos on the mixed grip chin-up mistakes and the weighted chin-up versus the mixed grip chin-up. Another thing I would say as a free gain, or the most underrated free gain, is spending a long time getting strong in the first place. Now, Philip and Martina Chubb behind the Mindful Mover, they train, when I spoke to them in the interview, were training once a week. In fact, they were training once every 8 days. They were training with such an intensity, they needed 8 days off to recover. And if they still didn't feel recovered by the 8th day, they then took another day off. Now, as easy as it would be to shoot down this methodology, when you've got someone like Philip who can do handstand push-ups on the rings, weighted one-arm chin-ups, and planche push-ups, you probably want to check that out. I would say getting strong in itself is a free gain. I managed to achieve my first human flag, ring muscle up, and wall-assisted handstand push-up when my bench was at its strongest. I was 3 weeks out from a meet. I would tried handstand push-ups against a wall for as long as I could remember, hopelessly flailing against a wall. 3 weeks out from a meet, my bench was as strong as it's ever been. manage a human flag, ring muscle up, wall assisted handstand push up, all within the space of a week. Strength is such a general quality, as is hypertrophy, that if you've developed strength and hypertrophy, then all you can do, or all you can get away with doing, is teaching your body how to coordinate the movement pattern. In the case of the human flag, it was simply teaching myself how to push with one arm and pull with the other, which is obviously not a pattern we typically do unless you're involved in something like archery. But strength allows you to play at a higher level, whether that's, for example, literally you can take more time off of training because you've built such a strength reserve, you've built such a foundation of muscle mass that it's not going to deteriorate quickly, or literally because you are so strong, you can cause so much muscular damage when you do train that you can necessitate needing that time off. Whereas if you're a beginner, I don't necessarily think that the low frequency model is going to work for you, just simply because you can't afford to damage yourself to the extent where you actually need that. So just to contextualize the concept of free gains, I decided to test where my 1 rep max was after 5.5 months off of the gym and not having access to the gym. Now you might think, hang on a minute, the same person who says don't jump into 1 rep max testing after so much time away, build yourself in, start light, why are you doing this? Well, firstly, as a competitive powerlifter, I'm much more attuned to knowing where my effort level is at on a given day than most people who are blinded by their ego. The next one is, as I've said previously, the difference between sort of max, so your max for the day, not lifetime, max, which would be something like where you're at after a 4 to 6 week block, or maybe a little bit longer, and then max, which might be a lifetime best or something you would only pull in competition. So the interesting things to note here is that in 5.5 months, my squat strength has depreciated 20%. If you look at the video, honestly, I think I had a lot more in the tank. And for someone who was chasing 140 kilo back squat for the best part of 3 years,
come on. Push.
and failed it more times than any other lift, to come back and be able to do 140 kilos with 5.5 months off and with no bilateral squats, firstly shows that there's probably some free gains to be had from heavy skater squats. So for example, I managed to get up to 64 kilo skater squat, which is basically like a step back lunge, except you drop the knee behind you only, not the foot. So there's probably some crossover here in terms of how strong you can get unilaterally versus how strong you can get bilaterally. More impressive, or something I'm happier with, is my 100 kilo bench. I've done little to no pressing movements at all during the time off. And interestingly, the last time I tested my max was with a friendly competition between a good friend of mine, and I hit 105 kilos, whereas with no access to a bench press, I've hit 100 kilos after 5.5 months off. So the biggest free gain you can ever have, in my humble opinion, is to spend a long time building strength, because it then sticks around a long time as well. Interestingly, my lifetime best overhead press is 75 kilos, and I've only lost 10 kilos, again, with minimal overhead pressing. The only access to load I've had is 35 kilo barbell, which, if, for example, you wanted to deadlift 200 kilos, you wouldn't start smashing a load of reps with 50 kilos. Unfortunately, those two things are too far apart for that to ever be the case. But because I've focused on accommodating resistance in my pulling work, so for example, mixed grip chin-ups where I've leant towards one side and then done single arm eccentrics.
Mostly on this side, I'm only using my left arm as a bit of assistance. When I get to the top, I'm going to push away with my left hand so that I can take as much weight through this right side as possible.
Single arm lowers has obviously kept enough strength in my upper body to be thereabouts with my pressing strength, and also actually improve my weighted chin-up strength, despite the fact I've done no weighted chin-ups in the entirety of this 5.5 month block in which gyms have been closed. Finally, my deadlift strength, again, I've had no access to anything heavier than 35 kilos, and yet I've managed to pull 200 kilos with a belt first day back, or 190 kilos without a belt. I remember my first powerlifting competition in 2017, and 180 kilos, didn't budge off the floor, biggest letdown ever. And
come on, Tony, come on!
Fast forward 4 years, and I'm pulling 200 with nearly half a year out of the gym. So if you take one thing from this talk, it's that building the huge base of strength over a number of years might be the best example of a free gain. And it also allows you to take more time off, lose less strength, and still be hitting more than respectable numbers. Imagine being able to take nearly half a year off and still being stronger pound for pound than majority of the people you'll meet in a commercial gym. Again, wouldn't dare say that in a powerlifting gym, wouldn't want to embarrass myself like that, but strength and hypertrophy are probably the most general physical qualities that you'll get, and as a result of building this huge strength base, I've also been able to do a human flag, a ring muscle up, a wall assisted handstand push up, working towards a one arm chin up, and this was all from getting my upper body as strong as possible for as long as possible. To my next analogy, which is how often should you be testing your maximum. Someone like Usain Bolt sprints 100 meters, he's going to need about 2 weeks off, probably a bit more, because his capacity is so damn high. Whereas, for example, sports day, you'll get kids run the 100-meter race and then 5 minutes later run the 200. In elite athletics, it doesn't work like that. So how often should you be testing your max? For me, this depends on what gender you are, not because I'm sexist, because generally speaking, men will be able to innovate more muscle fibers just by sheer fact of having more of them than women because of hormonal differences between men and women. So typically, men would test less frequently. Second to that, I think men should spend more time developing strength and less time expressing it on Instagram. Secondly, women, again, generally speaking, not necessarily always the case, generally need to spend more time testing strength because they don't actually realize how strong they are, especially if they're inexperienced, and because there might be, for example, fears of failing the lift. So typically, I would say women can test it more frequently. Also, women recover faster from relatively high percentages of their one repetition max compared to men. So for example, a woman could train with more frequency compared to a man on the same program. Women could recover quicker, and you'll find, for example, a woman might be able to do something like 5 reps with 90 or 95% of their one rep max, whereas a man just couldn't get away with that. A great example of this is if you look at the elite women in the CrossFit Games. They're absolutely amazing specimens, but the fact that I think it was Sigmundsson who managed to rep out 90% of her deadlift max for 10, and then I remember hearing an interview where she went for a new 1RM which was a couple of kilos heavier, and it just didn't budge. So again, there's highly individual nature to that, but generally speaking, men, check your ego, spend more time developing your strength. So for example, stuff like 5 sets of 5, less time testing your strength. And women, it's okay to put load on the bar. And remember, the stronger you are, the more that the one repetition maximum is going to take out of you. If you're an elite level powerlifter, so again, not that I'm calling myself that, but if I'm training to get a lifetime best, that's going to take the best part of 6 to 12 months. Whereas, for example, me back in the day, or a beginner, enjoy the beginner gains, you're probably going to add weight to the bar every week. The final thing to bring up is the difference between maxes. Now, this might sound semantic, but I like the way that Dan John organizes it. He's got what he calls sorter maxes, so, or an everyday maximum, as Will Wayland likes to call it. This is whatever your max is on that day. It's not a lifetime best, it's just as heavy as you feel like going on that day. You've then got maxes, which are, for example, after a 4 to 6 week block. And then you've got maxes, which typically will happen in competition. Again, if you're a non-barbell athlete as well, so your sport isn't the barbell, or you're just using the gym for the purposes of getting stronger, strength is important, but only because of what you're going to get from that increased strength. So for example, it will hopefully allow you to sprint faster, hopefully allow you to jump higher. But if you're testing your sprint speed and your jump height and that isn't moving, then maybe it's time to look at other things like your technique in the sprints, your technique in the jumps. So you could say, do you even need to test your max? If the purpose of the strength is to allow you to jump higher, then why not just test how high you can jump? So measure what actually matters. I think once every 4 to 6 weeks is okay for most people with 1 to 2 years of experience under their belt. Anything more than 2 years, and I'd probably say you want to be testing your max out no more or no sooner than once every 3 months, because you need to allow your body to adjust either to the technical nuances of what you've been working on. So for example, maybe you're going for your pin squats or your paw squats or your tempo squats. You need to allow your body to acclimatize to that technique. Equally, maybe you're adding muscle mass and then you're seeing if this impacts your strength. Give your body enough time to adjust to the differences between those two as well. It's no point going from, say, blocks of 3 sets of 12 and then straight into 1RMs, because your body's been used to producing force on a more endurance type scale, and now you're asking it to be an explosive athlete. So give your body enough time to adjust. Maybe have a period of, for example, 12 reps, period of 10, period of 8, period of 6, period of 4, and you slowly start to bring it closer to what you're asking it to do. As I said, developing strength versus testing strength. Everything you see on Instagram, or 99.9% of it, because it's all about the likes, is about making sure that it looks as big as possible on Instagram. So it needs to look heavy, it needs to look like it took a lot of effort, and oh my god, it needs to look like it's viral worthy. No one wants to see the video of the punch the clock type workouts where you go into the gym and nothing's super heavy, it's all relatively consistent, you punch the clock, you get in, you punch it on the way out, and it's nothing to write home about. It was perfect technique, it was reasonably hard but not insanely difficult, but the punch the clock sessions, that's where you're developing strength. The ego testing or the ego lifting and testing of strength, that is not where strength is built. The problem with Instagram and social media is it shows you the destination, but it doesn't show you the journey. So the majority of what you see is how you express a physical quality, not how you develop it. You'll see someone who has got the 1 rep max with loads of weight on the bar. You'll see the athlete touching the rim of the backboard. You'll see the person casually dropping into the middle split. This is expressing a quality, but you don't see the hard work that got them there. You don't see the patience it took. You don't see the deload weeks. You don't see the technical precision. This is where I think something like a 7 RPE is so underrated in most people's training. A 7 RPE means you've got 3 repetitions left in the tank. And I think it's underutilized by a lot of people, because by definition, a 7 RPE should still be relatively difficult. Like, it catches your attention, you know you're working now, but it's not so crushingly difficult that you feel that you might fail. Equally, another thing I've used in my own training, which has been particularly useful, is something like 4 to 5 reps at 7 RPE, then you go to 8 RPE, then you go to 9 RPE, then you drop back down to 7s for a couple more sets. So what this does, I feel, is help calibrate your effort. Sometimes you'll do a set of 5 reps at 7 RPE, so 3 reps in the tank, and you add load to what you think will be an 8 RPE, and you're like, oh no, I've still got more than 3 repetitions in the tank, and it helps calibrate your effort. Whereas if you go off a ballpark percentage, let's say you squatted 100 kilos in week 1, and then, I don't know, you're using 80% of your max in, I don't know, week 6 or whatever. Now, week 6 you're flying, 80% feels great, but then week 7, again, no sleep, no food, had an argument with the missus, whatever, and you're massively fatigued, and now 80% feels like 90%. Now you're doing 5 reps with 90%, and now you're failing lifts. So this is why having that internal clock, if you will, or that internal measure of intensity, as well as the external measure of what's on the bar is useful to calibrate it. So in summary, do Get Strong Quick programs work? I'm reminded of the famous quote from Anchorman, 60% of the time, they work every time. And for me, that is because they either work because you were so weak in the first place, and anything would have worked, but congratulations, you're stronger, you followed a program, well done you. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you already had a very good foundation anyway, which allowed you to peak very quickly because it was just a case of getting back into training. So for me, they work at either end. I've been able to get ready for a meet in 6 weeks because I had a foundation. I qualified for nationals, and then there was a 6-week turnaround to nationals, so I was already pretty strong anyway. Or, like I said, they work because you're a beginner, and hey ho, everything works for a beginner. Now, this sounds like I'm being facetious, but programs work until they don't. If we go back to my slide on hypertrophy, strength, and peaking, you will keep continually getting stronger, and then all of a sudden you won't. Now, it might be that you can no longer get away with sloppy technique and you need to make some technical changes. It might be that you're not strong enough to push the threshold up anymore. It might be that you haven't got sufficient muscle mass to push any more weight without making further changes to muscle mass. So I'm not trying to be awkward and give non-committal answers, but you need to understand why your 1RM is failing. I've had a massively beneficial experience working with a powerlifting coach, and the biggest thing we've changed is my technique. And we've changed this by using what I call brothers or sisters of the lift. So for example, if your back squat is your competition lift, its brother might be something like a paw squat, or its sister might be something like a pin squat. We don't want third cousin twice removed where you're telling me that, I don't know, doing a leg extension is going to help you squat more weight. I've had success deadlifting once a week when a few years ago when I was using the 5-5's Mad Cow version. So that was a low frequency program. I've had gains with pressing 4 times a week, which was a relatively high volume or high frequency program. For me, frequency is obviously important, but the most important thing is consistency over the long haul. It makes me laugh when people say, oh, how often do you train? And I really want to be that dick and be like, oh, I train 4 to 5 times a week for 5 to 6 years. But it's not me trying to show off. But the reality is, if you commit to program after program after program for years on end, you will get stronger. Like strength and hypertrophy, obviously everyone knows that one person who rarely trains, who's strong as fuck, and who is incredibly ripped and who happens to have good genes. But the reality is, if you put the time and effort in, you will be rewarded. Strength sticks around a long time, and what I love about strength sports is, unlike other sports, if you didn't lift the weight, sometimes hands up, you just weren't good enough, you just weren't strong enough on that day. When the program stops working, take a step back. Is it a technical fault? Is it because you don't have enough muscle mass? Is it, hands up, simply I'm not strong enough at this point? You also want to make sure that you're applying something called phase potentiation. This basically means that are the qualities you're building in this block going to act as a springboard to the qualities in the next block? So for example, if you're building muscle mass in, say, the triceps or the quadriceps or the posterior chain, you would then hope that you can use that bigger muscle to produce more force in the next block. When you're producing more force in that block, you then hope you can technically refine it for the peaking block. But if, for example, you go from sets of, I don't know, 10 to 12 in the hypertrophy block straight into 1 rep maxes, you're not really building on those 2 phases. In fact, you're probably trying to stretch Armstrong the body and pull it in 2 different directions. So you need to make sure that you are potentiating the next phase by building on the qualities that you've built. Remember, you cannot endure a quality that you do not have. So if you're, for example, working on strength endurance, so still relatively heavy load in the 8 to 12 rep max range, but you're not strong in the first place, then you're going to have a hard time dealing with that. So as I said, what is your limiting factor? Are you working on it? If you're struggling with this or struggling to identify it, then firstly, I would recommend these resources here. So Scientific Principles of Strength Training, superb book. Chris Beardsley's book, Strength is Specific. I've already done a book review on, or video review on this on YouTube, and the Renaissance Periodization anything from them is absolute gold. Remember, there are 8 different ways strength can be specific. So if you are using the barbell for purposes of improving sports performance, then the movement pattern, as much as S&C coaches love to tell you that that is the most important thing, is one of only 7 variables. But to check out that book, check out my video review. If you found this useful, then feel free to sign up to my Patreon, where there's other exclusive strength and conditioning content on there, and I'm making by request educational content, as well as my ever expanding movement library, all of my calisthenics kids lessons, several different strength and conditioning programs I've written, all available on there. Thank you very much. Like, share, and if you have a question, then feel free to reach out to me and get in touch. Thank you very much for listening. Todd Davidson, P2P Coaching.